Well, in this series, of which this is the last lecture, I'm sad to say, we've heard a lot about the Dutch monopoly of trade with the Indonesian archipelago. We've heard about Batavia, the Dutch headquarters, modern Jakarta. We've heard about spices from the islands of the Java Sea and the lucrative carrying trade that brought porcelain and silk and lacquerware through Dutch ports at vast profits back to the rest of Europe. Well, few people in Europe or America today know more about the art of that part of the world than our speaker today, Dr. Ruth Barnes. For 7 years, she's been the Thomas Jaffe Curator and the first head of the Department of Indo-Pacific Art here at the gallery. Before coming here, she had been curator of textiles at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, where she was also lecturer in the Faculty of Oriental Studies and School of Anthropology. She received her master's degree from the University of Edinburgh and the DPhil from Oxford. She worked as a researcher in several of the great museums of ethnographical material, the Pitt Rivers in Oxford and the Museum für Völkerkunde in Frankfurt. The 14 books that she's written or edited are mainly concerned with Southeast Asian textiles, about which she is a preeminent expert. She's also produced a 30-year-long succession of articles on many, many topics: weaving, wood carving, basketry, Indian trade textiles, and gold. She's organized the holdings of several important private collections into museum displays of great coherence and beauty, that of Ernst Vatter in Frankfurt, and here at Yale of Thomas Jaffe, which was and is the founding collection here, and is a reason for tremendous pride in the gallery. In fact, over the last 6 years, the gallery has put on Ruth's dazzling exhibition of old Javanese gold, and then her lucid permanent installation of the Indo-Pacific Gallery on the third floor, and her large exhibition called East of the Wallace Line, Monumental Art from Indonesia and New Guinea, which was an education in itself. In her time at Yale, Ruth has not only taught Yale students in class, but she's also taught the rest of the gallery's audience, me included, about Southeast Asian cultures and their contacts and exchanges with Europe, things that we might not otherwise have known about. And I'm deeply grateful to her. Her topic today is East meets West in miniature. I'm very happy to introduce Ruth Barnes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. It's a delight, of course, to be here in my own space, talking to colleagues, friends, and the general audience in this wonderful lecture series. The Dutch abroad and what they brought home. The series invites us to think about the expanding European view of the world at the time of Dutch expansion in the 17th century. It also wants us to look at how these contacts changed the home environment. Dutch paintings of the time recorded these changes in detail. However, my lecture today is not primarily concerned with painting, with shifts in genre and representations of mood and emotions, nor is it about allegorical or possibly even symbolic meanings that might give a deeper significance to the marvelously realistic and almost tactile representations in the 17th century. My expertise tries to be Southeast Asia and its position in the wider world of Indian Ocean contacts. But I hope that I can link that theme effectively to the lecture series. What they brought home suggests domestic interior. we have ample evidence for the presence of foreign goods, of East Asian porcelain, Oriental carpets, you see that examples of both in this painting, and of exotic fruit, also shown here, in still life details and occasionally in interior views. But one of the best comprehensive views of what a cosmopolitan Dutch home might have looked like in the 17th century is provided by a small group of dolls' houses that have survived in several museums in the Netherlands. One of the best known is the one you see here, a doll's house that has been in Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum's permanent collection since 1875. It even inspired a novel, The Miniaturist, by Jessie Burton, which became a bestseller and sold over 1 million copies. The house was not intended to be a children's toy, but it was commissioned by an adult woman, Petronella Ortman, who lived in Amsterdam from 1656 to 1716. She was 19 years old when she married her first husband, a wealthy silk merchant called Karl Witte. She became a widow in 1685, but remarried the following year. Her second husband, Johannes Brandt, also was a silk merchant and no doubt also very wealthy. It was at this time that she had the doll's house built and started to decorate and furnish it with lavish miniature copies of items that could have been part of a well-to-do Dutch burgher's house. In doing so, she followed a peculiar fashion of wealthy Dutch women in the second half of the 17th century to commission miniature houses that were replicas of domestic interiors. These dolls' houses were the focus of social visits in which all the miniature features were very much shown off. The owners might even commission tiny blue and white china, as you see there. Tiny blue and white porcelain from China to display in the doll's kitchen or on cabinets and mantelpieces. Hand-painted and resist-dyed chintz from India, decorated, I'll show you a detail of this later, decorated walls and bed curtains, and renowned painters could be brought in actually to produce miniature murals. We know that Petronella engaged, in fact, two painters, Willem Fredriksson van Rooyen and Johannes Voorhout, who supplied murals for two of the rooms. Fortunes were spent on these creations. Petronella's daughter Hendrina, who inherited the doll's house after her mother's death in 1716, claimed that her mother had spent 30,000 guilders on decorating the house, an enormous sum at the time that might have bought an Amsterdam canal front house. The dolls' houses also gained a certain celebrity status. Petronella Ortman's house was permanently captured in painting by the portrait and landscape painter Jacob Appel. The dolls' houses were the ladies' equivalent of their husbands' cabinets of curiosities, which could be equally elaborate display cases that showed off natural or man-made objects collected from distant parts of the world, such as shells, rare and newly discovered plants, or strange rock formations. These could either be collected by the person himself or acquired from travelers or dealers in such curiosities. And quite often, these cases were made of Chinese lacquer and painted with Oriental scenes. In fact, the ground floor parlor of Petronella's house has just such a cabinet on the back wall in miniature, and this would open up to shelves showing the possibly shells, stones, plants, strange curiosities, many of them coming from India and Southeast Asia. Of course, one could explore in great depth the social and psychological reason for creating these elaborate miniature perfections of domesticity. I will not follow this particular train of thought, but will focus instead on where the foreign and often exotic objects, the porcelain, lacquer, and precious textiles came from, and how they came to be part of the Dutch urban domestic life. As part of that investigation, we will follow the Dutch abroad all the way, almost to the end of the world as it was known at the time. A popular account of the Asian spice route by the author John Key gives a wonderfully lucid introduction to the Indian Ocean world in the early modern period. By early modern, we mean from about 1500 onwards. He argues that spices, condiments, resins, and aromatics, as well as exotic, and to the Western reader at least, rather strange delicacies such as birds' nests and sea slugs, were the major driving force of international trade in this period. As erudite, delectable, and entertaining as his book is, he presents only a partial view. Ships need ballast to travel on an even keel, and this was provided by wood, grains, occasionally even by tombstones. In fact, there was a thriving trade in tombstones coming from northwest India, Gujarat in particular, where in the town of Cambay, there were workshops that specialized in the production of these stone monuments. And I am showing you here the tomb of Malik Ibrahim from Gresik in northern Java, who died in 1419, and his tomb is still venerated now because he brought. He was one of the first people who brought Islam to northern Java. His tombstone was one of those made in Gujarat. To these bulk items were added Indian cotton textiles and silk from China and vast amounts of ceramics from East Asia. For the European merchants involved in the Asian trade from the 16th century onwards, spices and condiments could not be the only cargo, and to focus on them exclusively gives a very tilted picture. When the European merchant companies became involved in the trade with Asia, they quickly had to adapt to a new, complex market in goods that fueled a vast network of communities. They had to learn where the production centers were and how to access them. The Portuguese were the first Europeans, closely followed by the Spanish, who ventured into the maritime trade in Asia from the late 15th century onwards. They entered a world that had been connected by trade routes and cultural contacts for centuries. The Indian Ocean has been the hub of cultural and economic contact since the time of late antiquity, at the latest. This is attested by historical writers of the Greek and Roman period, and it has been noted by medieval travelers such as Ibn Battuta and, of course, Marco Polo. Arab and Indian merchants had sailed most parts of the Indian Ocean for centuries, and Chinese junks were also periodically involved in the maritime trade. By the time of the European arrival in the early 1500s, many of the Asian coastal regions had been influenced by this diversity. For example, when the first Portuguese vessels arrived in 1516 in the Solar Strait, now that is in the most remote part of eastern Indonesia, about there. It provides one of the few calm harbors on the route between the northern Malaccan Spice Islands and the island of Timor here, which was a major supplier for sandalwood. When the first Portuguese arrived in this particular strait, they already found present a small but very well established Arab community who had made some converts to Islam, and there were also Gujarati and Chinese merchants, the latter manufacturing gunpowder. The European contacts were initially driven by the search for spices and aromatics, pepper from India and Sumatra, cinnamon from South and Southeast Asia, and especially in search of the sources for cloves and nutmeg, at the time exclusively grown in a few islands in eastern Indonesia. The Portuguese dominance in this trade was eventually broken a century later when the Dutch and English trading companies were established. They soon eclipsed their Iberian rivals in the Asian theater. Although the original driving force was the quest for spices, the effect was far more wide-reaching as new commodities reached European markets and transformed people's lives. How they ate, the dishes they ate from, how they dressed, and how they furnished their houses. Let's look at where the Dutch actually had to go in their search. Although their center of power in maritime Southeast Asia eventually became Java, with Batavia as the main settlement, that is present-day Jakarta. When the Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, sent the first ships out to follow the spice trade, these traveled to eastern Indonesia, to Ternate and Tidore, just tiny little islands off the coast of Halmahera, and to the Banda Islands, which can hardly be seen in the Banda Sea on that map. The former, Ternate and Tidore, were the main source for cloves at the time, while the latter, the Bandas, grew nutmeg and the nutmeg byproduct, maize. Ternate and Tidore were ruled by powerful sultans who had been Muslims since the late 13th century, while Banda was governed by an oligarchy of so-called orang kaya, which means rich men. And that's one of the small Banda Islands, the very active volcano opposite the capital island of Banda Neira. And there you have the nutmeg fruit and the nutmeg fruit cut open on the right, with the red membrane is what is known as maize, and it covers the nutmeg itself, which you have to crack open, and it contains the kernel. Now, it was 3 weeks ago, maybe a little bit longer ago, maybe 4 weeks ago, my husband and I actually traveled to the Bandas. And this was the second of, for us, great adventure to the real, actual Spice Islands. We've both for decades been working, writing, researching the early years of European presence and their connection with Asian communities in Southeast Asia, but we had not until recently been to Ternate, Tidore, and then this year to the Banda Islands. We were impressed on both trips with how absolutely tiny these places are. How did people ever find them? Especially remote are the Banda Islands. We had to fly. We flew from Bali, which is the hub for inter-island travel by air in Indonesia. We flew from Bali to Makassar, from Makassar to Ambon, and in Ambon we caught the express boat. Twice a week there is a boat that goes to the Banda Islands. It is 6 hours across open sea, sitting on very narrow benches, surrounded by very seasick Indonesians. Fortunately, at the very end of this exhausting trip, we found that the hotel we stayed in actually was an old Dutch plantation, and it was most comfortable. The owner's wife was a wonderful cook. So we had the opportunity to see nutmeg plantations, Dutch forts, and we were again astonished that although these islands are so remote, they were once part of a long, well-established trade network that reached from New Guinea to mainland Southeast Asia, to India, all the way into the Middle East. Their spices had long been exchanged for Indian textiles. You see a very fine, especially popular, but a very expensive silk cloth here made in Gujarat called a patolu, which is decorated with the very complex double ikat resist method. Too complicated to explain in any detail here, but very much part of the trade of textiles for spices. This has been recorded in the earliest documentations accounted by the earliest accounts by Europeans. And we have several very fine examples of these textiles here at the art gallery. Also important was metalwork and, of course, East Asian ceramics. The Portuguese and later the Dutch brought gifts and tried to impose treaties. For gifts, I want to show you in particular this helmet here, which was presented by the Governor General of the Dutch East Indies, Jan Petersen Koen, to the Sultan of Ternate. It's now still in the Sultan's treasury. If you look at it in detail, the design here clearly shows tulips, the Dutch favorite flower that, of course, came to Europe via the Ottoman Empire. The treaties that the Portuguese and later the Dutch tried to impose were usually very difficult to establish and to keep up. It was a very complex and very difficult to establish a sustaining trading relationship. These Eastern Indonesian communities didn't really see any reason why they should follow the treaties that the Europeans tried to impose. After all, they had been trading for centuries and had been very successful at it. So the encounter with Europeans was fraught from the very beginning. This came especially to the forefront on the Banda Islands, where the Dutch tried to establish a monopoly on trading nutmeg with the local rulers, but also against English competition. It quickly led to bloody encounters. In 1609, the Dutch set out to build a fort, later to be called Fort Nassau, on Banda Neira. But they were ambushed by the Bandanese, who killed 46 men. The next 12 years saw repeated skirmishes between the Dutch and locals, but also between the two European powers. The English had established themselves on Pulo. Pulo means island. Pulo Run and Pulo I, the two you see here, are Run, or in Indonesian called Run. Run is the island on the right. They are tiny islands just to the west of Banda. Run on the right is at its furthest extent is 1.5 miles long. It is today still the site of nutmeg plantations, has a few small communities on it. The English tried to defend their access to the lucrative nutmeg trade against Dutch intervention. And for that, they established themselves on Run and I for that purpose. The Dutch eventually attacked them on I and forced them to retreat to Run. Several hundred men were slaughtered on both sides until finally the English retreated from the island of Run. But they claimed a nominal title to it until 1667, when in the Treaty of Breda, England finally accepted the Dutch sovereignty over Run and swapped the island for Manhattan, renaming New Amsterdam, New York, and of course the rest is history. The Dutch encounter with the people of Banda was even more brutal. In 1621, the Dutch East Indies Governor General Jan Pietersen Koen tried to enforce a treaty with the Orang Kaya, the rulers, that would establish the absolute Dutch monopoly over the nutmeg and maize trade under unacceptable conditions. When the VOC assumed violations of the treaty, they brought in Japanese mercenaries to kill the rulers. 40 Orang Kaya were butchered and beheaded. Their bodies were thrown into a deep ditch next to Fort Nassau. And here you see in that same ditch a cow grazing. A general bloodbath followed immediately when the entire male population of Banda was killed, from infants to old men. This effectively brought the indigenous Banda culture to an end. When we asked a guide who was showing us some of the nutmeg plantations on Banda, what the indigenous language of Banda was, because in most Indonesian islands you have the national language of Indonesian spoken, some English, and then there is a local language that is really the language that is used, much used outside the schools. He told us, we have no indigenous language. That was killed off when the Dutch, or rather the Japanese mercenaries, killed off so many people in our islands. So they speak Indonesian and a little bit of English. The nutmeg grows in Banda. An estimated 500,000 trees were then parceled off into 64 plots by Jan Pietersen Koen and given to Dutch planters. With only a few Bandanese left on the islands, slaves and indentured laborers were brought in from other parts of the island world to work in the nutmeg gardens. The Dutch planters were under contract to sell their products to the VOC, although they received only less than 120th part the price of what nutmeg was worth in the Netherlands. They still made a huge profit and built themselves spacious and luxurious houses, many decorated with rich imported furnishings. Fortunately, not all stories of Dutch encounters with the local population were as grim as the history of Banda. One remarkable man who worked for the VOC was Georg Eberhard Rumpf, known as Rumphius, who lived from 1627 to 1702, also known as the blind seer of Ambon, because he went blind in his middle age. He was born in Germany but joined the VOC in 1652. He traveled to Batavia and on to Ambon, the major port and trading center of the Spice Islands. He transferred to the civilian part of the company and was appointed merchant at Fort Amsterdam in the village of Hila. He soon started to pay particular attention and study in detail the flora and fauna of the Spice Islands. In this undertaking, he was supported fully by the Governor General of the VOC in Batavia. Rumphius spent the rest of his life in Ambon, although he kept up quite a lively correspondence with European scientists and was made a member of a scientific society in Vienna. He had an Ambonese wife and several children. His oldest son became his closest assistant, who helped him with his scientific work, especially after Rumphius himself went blind from glaucoma at the age of 43. He is still known for two groundbreaking publications, one of the classification of the plants of Ambon, the other dedicated to indigenous sea life. And of course, his sketches, when they made their way back to Europe, especially in Holland, had a great effect on presentations of shells, which often appear in still life paintings. His life, unfortunately, was marked by misfortune and bad luck. Apart from going blind, he lost his wife and one of his daughters in an earthquake, and his manuscripts were destroyed by fire or lost at sea on their way to be printed. Fortunately, some people who approved, who very much supported his work in Batavia, had made copies of of the manuscripts so that eventually they could be published. He himself never saw any of his work in print. But when they finally were published posthumously, they became standard works of classification and are still considered very important today. Now, we've looked at the furthest away from Holland we could get, really to the other side of the world. On the way, though, it was necessary to stop off and develop other trading ports and trading connections in other parts of Asia, in particular in India. The spices of the East Indies brought extreme riches to the Netherlands, but the trade in them needed to be fueled by other goods. Apart from silver and gold currency, there were very few exports from Northern Europe that had more than a brief novelty appeal. Who in Asia wanted woolen coats? It was essential for the VOC to gain access to and control of an inter-Asian market. In particular, the traders had to have access to Indian textiles, which were much in demand in the islands of Southeast Asia. For this reason, the company established settlements in India. Two regions were of particular importance for the textile trade. There's Gujarat, which produced printed cotton textiles, but also complexly patterned double ikat silks. I showed you one earlier. And the Coromandel Coast in southeast India. The Southeast Indian location was the place for producing the very fine hand-drawn Indian chintz textiles. And I'm showing you here a print workshop from a photograph taken actually earlier this year, and one of the earliest prints that survived from the trade between India to Southeast Asia, which we have here in the gallery actually. These textiles go back to the 15th century. It continued throughout the Dutch presence, and the Dutch tried to impose a monopoly on that trade with these textiles. I'm also showing you a very fine example of one of the chintz textiles, hand-painted, with wonderful scenes, settings showing birds, squirrel creatures. There's a parrot that actually has caught a snake, and the snake looks rather, I think it's, where is it? It's there. There's the parrot, and it in its mouth, in its beak, it has a snake that looks as though it says, well, it is destiny. The Dutch settlements in Surat, Gujarat, and in Pulicat, in what is present-day Andhra Pradesh, gave access to these textile workshops. The VOC supported substantial trading posts in both locations. What remains of them today are mostly the impressive cemeteries, ostentatious monuments to the Dutch presence, but also reminders of the transience of life. And I found it especially sad to find this very large tombstone, which commemorates the death of a little girl who died at the age of 2. Surat today remains a major industrial and manufacturing center of Gujarat and has a population of millions, while Pulicat now is little more than a forlorn backwater, a small fishing port with a few boats in its filthy harbor. But once it was the center of Dutch commerce in South India, with access to textile workshops that produced the finest and most desirable chintz cotton textiles, hand-drawn with resists and mordants and dyed in luminescent colors. The VOC once again tried to establish a monopoly for access to these goods with very mixed success. Although initially traded to be used as currency in the exchange for spices, the printed and hand-painted textiles also soon made their way home to the Netherlands. The lightweight cotton, dyed in fast colors, were a major attraction, and they became the fashion in Europe. You see some very attractive, especially the children's jackets are general favorites in the Rijksmuseum. They were so popular that they were a major rival to the indigenous textile industry, and there were even attempts to ban their import. The expanding trade with Asia, of course, also brought the Dutch in touch with the fine glazed ceramics of East Asia, of China and especially Japan. Until now, Northern European ceramics had been heavy stone and earthenware pots, and you see that in the painting on the left. You see several examples of these vessels, mostly brown or gray, painted with blue, very heavy, while the newly available East Asian goods added unprecedented color and luminosity to the Dutch table. You see two examples on the table here, and that's still life on the right there, and that precariously balanced plate about to topple off on that basket. In Japan, the Dutch managed to establish a colony in Nagasaki on the island of Deshima. They gained access to Japanese silver and copper. But they also found that the export of porcelain and lacquerware had a ready market at home. It transformed Dutch households. The new vessels were used to serve new food and drinks, chocolate, tea, and coffee, called for new shapes of cups and serving containers. These imported wares also were a major incentive to change the local production of ceramics in attempts to imitate the quality and design of East Asian dishes. You see here a Delftware imitating a Japanese design that is usually associated with Arita ware, but you see it here on a tin-glazed earthenware example. Initial copies appeared on Dutch tin-glazed earthenware, but the lasting result, of course, was the European discovery of the secrets of porcelain manufacture, which occurred slightly later than the timescale of our lecture series in the early 18th century, first at Meissen in Saxony, then in France and England. These European manufacturers remained deeply inspired by East Asian designs. After a journey to the other side of the globe, let us finally return to Petronella Ortmann's doll's house and look in close detail at how much we see of Asian reflections in the displays of furnishings and utensils, fabrics, paintings, and dishes. And I'm going to show you details from 3 rooms: the kitchen, the bedroom up here, and the parlor down here. We have the kitchen with its dresser full of blue and white ware. Some of it may be imports from Japan, maybe from China. Of course, some of it may also be locally made Dutch Delftware. But surely there are designs, even if it is local production, they are very much influenced by porcelain imported from Japan. Above the dresser, we have, well, where are we? Lost it. We have paintings that are clearly an Oriental setting. Now let's look at the top bedroom on the left. You see just through the doorway here, you have a bedchamber. And there's another one here. The curtains for the bed curtains are clearly Indian block printed or hand-drawn fabrics. Reproduced in miniature, of course. We've seen at the beginning of the lecture the cabinet here at the back of the wall of the lower parlor, used for display of curiosities. It is a Japanese or Chinese lacquer cabinet. On top are displays of let me just see. There we go. We have little bottles and flasks displayed, again blue and white, East Asian influenced or imported from East Asia. What do we have though on the wall? The wall is covered, and this would have been a textile cover, is covered with a rather electric zigzag pattern. What may have been this strange, visually distracting material? Well, the answer is actually right here at the Yale Art Gallery. And we see that in this really superb example of one of several that arrived in our collection last summer from the former collection of Jeff Holmgren and Anita Spertus, acquired by Thomas Jaffe for us to be brought into the gallery as a promised gift. And I really find it remarkable that this pattern, although of course it's red rather than yellow and orange, is a fine equivalent of the wall cover that we see in this doll's house. I wouldn't want to live with it, but but I think the parallel is really remarkable. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions if you have any.
Thank you for that wonderful lecture. I I just was wondering, and maybe I missed a detail in what I was reading on some of the slides that you were showing, but can you help me to understand the scale of the items in the dollhouse? For example, I was wondering about in the kitchen, the little blue and white pieces of china.
How they were?
The scale, the size
The
of
scale.
them, the dimensions, yeah.
Well, the whole doll's house is about as high as this. It's about as high as this. So those little pots would be maybe an inch at most. Yeah.
Connecticut, as you know, is the nutmeg state, and with the emphasis on nutmeg, I'm curious about the nutmeg trade out of Connecticut and whether or not there was any connection with the New Amsterdam imports of nutmeg.
That is, I will have to ask a local. I know that that the nutmeg state actually refers to, isn't it wooden copies of nutmegs? Can someone tell me? Yes?
Those little islands you talked about, are they going to be put under the ocean as the sea level rises? Oh, could you hear? Will sea level rise get rid of those two little islands you were talking about?
Sorry? Oh, the islands of Ai and Run. They are just off the small group of Banda Islands to the northwest. They are very small. As I said, Run is only 1.5 miles long. I would probably be about 4 miles long. And that's the maximum extent. They are still covered with nutmeg plantations. Have very, very rich soil. It is impressive when you visit these islands. It's of course volcanic soil, and the variety of cultivation that one finds on these islands is remarkable. You have very tall trees that give shade to the much smaller nutmeg and clove trees. The tall trees are called canary nut trees. That is a nut like an almond. And in the shaded areas, you have clove trees, nutmeg trees, you have pepper plants, and you also have chili peppers, which of course came originally from the Americas.
Yeah, my question is, will these islands disappear as the sea level rises?
Will they? They might, yes, depending on how much the sea level rises.
In an earlier lecture, Femke Dierks laid out for us how the importation of china and the collection thereof by the royal family, Queen Amelia in particular, who then sent off her daughters to be married throughout Europe and took along with them the china that they'd inherited from their parents and started a Europe-wide china craze, built again on the Dutch importation of the china into Europe. I'm curious if the fabrics that you've been showing here, again, being part of that trade coming home in the Dutch ships, similarly ended up distributed through Europe, and there was a similar European-wide craze for these Asian fabrics. You mentioned in Holland for sure, apparently, you know, the clothing, and you said the locals not enjoying the competition. How wide was that? Was this the Dutch Republic, or did this go throughout Europe?
It is actually, there are certain patterns that are found throughout that were generally exported and found a very welcome reception pretty much anywhere. But then there are also very specific designs that obviously there was a back and forth that plates were or drawings were sent off to the production centers to follow very precise designs, which there are settings of Dutch windmills and bridges, for example, that were obviously they was sent off as prints to Japan. Then the plates or the dishes were produced and returned, and those were specifically they were favored in the Dutch market. You had when I was at the Ashmolean Museum, we had a couple of sets of plates that had images of they were made in China, but they had images of the Oxford Botanical Garden gates. So that was very, very specific. We also have the trade in particular textile patterns. There, again, we have some that were accepted pretty much anywhere, and others were very, very specific. I showed you Dutch chintz, for example, for the Dutch market, which had the heraldic signs on them. Those would, of course, be either for a particular municipal community, or they would be for a particular family. You get the same, the use of heraldic imagery on plates, on dishes. So it's a very interesting mixture, and you get both, actually.
Can I speak to the nutmeg, Connecticut as the nutmeg
yes,
state?
please.
Although I'm hardly a local. But I heard just this last week on the radio, I think the Colin McEnroe show, that it was to do with two iconic Yankee characters, the Yankee sailor and the Yankee peddler, and Connecticut onions were exported to the Caribbean, one of which islands is the only other place beside the Banda Islands that grew nutmeg back then, and they brought back nutmegs to Connecticut. And then in turn, the iconic character, the Yankee peddler, would then export the nutmegs elsewhere in the American mainland, and by mythology or who knows, they would put in the sacks the wooden nutmeg and then cover it with real nutmegs. And this was regarded as Yankee ingenuity rather than a complete scam.
Thank you. Have things not changed?
Just wanted to add, we are not officially the nutmeg state. We're the Constitution state.
That's right.